The Trump administration has fundamentally changed the world order. We are no longer going to be singularly providing you with a security blanket. The Trump administration has fundamentally changed the world order. This is Steve Gibson, reporting author of Logic's Dictate. I want to recognize the production value of Tiger Logic with respect to this content. They are fantastic. I recommend them to everybody. The Trump administration has fundamentally changed the world order. It's not just that the Trump administration has taken a common sense, practical approach, but the Trump administration has changed what has been in place for decades. We have to start with a little history. That history is effectively the world order as it existed around a couple years after World War II. Immediately after World War II, the United States was clearly the world's superior power. We did not express that power internationally. We did not take over jurisdictions and make sure that they were democratically oriented. We basically were tired of fighting and tired of war, and we let the Soviet Union grow. We basically supported Japan and Europe and the rest of the world, and China for that matter, gave them money, gave them support in a wide variety of ways, and by doing so, we created a world order that had fundamentally two aspects. One, those countries that were supported by the United States, that were democratically oriented against the growing communist threat in the Soviet Union and then in communist China. Now, communist China was so backward economically and in a development state that it really wasn't that big of a concern, except with respect to what they might have done in Vietnam. The Soviet Union was economically more advanced. It was never as advanced as the United States, but it was aggressive in abusing its people, and in doing so supported economically and militarily the regime that controlled the Soviet Union. That world order was defined by the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War. It was not until Ronald Reagan came along in the 1980s and said, enough is enough. We are going to strategically deal with the Soviet Union. We're going to deal with them in a couple of different ways. We're going to deal with them economically, and we're going to deal with them scientifically and militarily. We are going to avoid the notion that mutually assured destruction by nuclear weapons is the only way that we could coexist. We're going to create a missile defense system, and we're going to outspend the Soviet Union in doing so. We effectively crushed the Soviet Union economically and thereby militarily, and then the Soviet Union became Russia. Well, throughout that history, the world order continued where the United States was providing a security blanket to Europe and Japan and others, and basically funded that security blanket economically and militarily on its own accord. The Europeans would continue to fund their social programs, and the Japanese would then be able to have effectively no offensive military capability and have relatively minimum defensive capability at the same time. The Japanese then decided, well, we're going to make cars, we're going to make electronics, we're going to flood those imports in the United States. And that basically made Japan an economic superpower in the 1980s. At that point, the Japanese in the early 1990s engaged in practices that led to economic stagflation that lasted for decades. They're no longer an economic superpower, although they continue to be quite effective at selling certain products such as cars and electronics. You're talking about a country with a $4 trillion economy, which was very close to catching up on gross domestic product with the United States in the 1980s, and basically now has an economy the size of California alone. Where are we at now then? What is this fundamental change that I'm talking about? Well, that fundamental change is the United States saying to Europe and its other allies, hold on a second. We are no longer going to be singularly providing you with a security blanket. You're going to have to support yourselves. There is absolutely no reason that NATO isn't strong enough at this point to deal with Russia. Russia can hardly tackle the Ukraine, let alone hope to have the prospect of ever conquering Germany, France, Italy, England, Spain, and the rest of the European Union, let alone the Norwegian country, the Scandinavian countries such as Norway and Finland and Sweden, now that they have joined NATO. That whole conglomerate, that whole amalgamation now of countries that are in NATO and in the European Union certainly have the autonomous ability to deal with any Russian adventurism that might occur. In addition, France and the United Kingdom continue to maintain a nuclear deterrent. They do not need the United States to have that nuclear deterrent. Now, why then do we have to spend $1.5 trillion on defense in the United States? That's something that concerns me. That is still a legacy of the past and a demand that is imposed upon the United States taxpayer that I think deserves serious examination. If there is a Democratic candidate out there that wants to be potentially successful, that Democratic candidate for office of the president should certainly be analyzing whether or not we need, based upon the New World Order, to spend $1.5 trillion on our defense budget. I think a strong argument can be made that the success that the Trump administration is having in rearranging the world order should mean that we should have an even bigger peace dividend and not be having to spend $1.5 trillion on defense. Imagine if we only had to spend $500 billion on defense and we had another $1 trillion to spend on other domestic programs. $1 trillion goes an awful long way, and I could be very creative on how to spend that money. Of course, that assumes that we even have that money to spend. Given the fact that we have trillions upon trillions of dollars of debt that is approaching the size of our annual gross domestic product and at times exceeding that gross domestic product, there are real questions as to whether or not we have the continued ability to spend that kind of money on international peacekeeping and defense. The question is also who would ever attack us and attack our economic interests that we don't have the current ability to defend against. These are all, I think, important questions that both Republican and Democratic candidates could debate vibrantly, and there should be a little bit more transparency on the part of the administration to explain why we need $1.5 trillion of defense spending given the change of the world order. What are the other elements of the change of the world order? We're not using boots on the ground. We're not invading Venezuela. We're basically extracting the lecherous, horrible tyrant out of Venezuela and changing that regime effectively and being able to unlock its oil. We're basically able to put pressure on Cuba without invading Cuba. We're able to deal with Iran from the air effectively and from the sea without having currently boots on the ground. It does not appear that we're going to have boots on the ground. This is a fundamental change in orientation where we can be strategic and tactical and successful without risking more American lives and more at stake with respect to the American economy. You're living in extremely exciting times. Please join me in analyzing these times and determining who is the best candidate to vote for in terms of advancing this new world order. Please like, subscribe, and follow so that we can continue to provide you with this content.